guys, and welcome to the Moms and Mysteries podcast, a true crime podcast featuring myself, Mandy, and my dear friend, Melissa. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Mandy. How are you?
I am doing wonderful. We are in a new month. It is August. That means it is officially the hottest month of the year.
I know. I keep thinking like it's almost better. And then my thigh sticks to my car seat and I'm like, this is miserable.
Yeah.
I need it to be done.
Yeah. They always say August is the hottest, but honestly, I would argue that September is just as bad as August.
I think September is terrible. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so while a lot of other, especially the more northern states, while you guys are considering September kind of this like entry into fall, I feel like it's just the hottest month of the year, part 2.
And I think there is like a little bit that is like, because our friends to the north have these cooler days that like we're so jealous and looking forward to it that it almost hurts more that it is so disgusting. Yeah, I know. I totally agree. If we didn't have to see their crap, I'd be fine. But some of them get like snow. I feel like Canada gets snow in September because it always blows my mind.
Yeah, it has definitely happened. There definitely won't be snow for us, but we are marching towards the end of the summer. So as Melissa was saying, we do kind of appreciate that. I don't mind the heat. I love living in Florida, and I've always said the weather doesn't it's hot. We love to complain about how hot it is, but I would rather that than be freezing cold in the winter. So I will take it. But I do appreciate those just a little bit cooler. I don't even want it to be that
Just the cooler
cold.
in the morning or cooler at night, like to do walks and stuff. Like that's what I'm looking for. I just can't boil all day. Like a little relief in there is all I'm looking for.
Just a slight drop in temperature and a little bit less humidity, and I'm a happy camper. Right. It doesn't even have to be cold. I don't even have to wear long sleeves. I just want it to be comfortable to walk outside your front door and take 6 steps to my car.
Yeah, that's it. We ask for so little, and yet we get nothing in return. Right. But we live here. We love it. Glad to be here. Glad to be with you, Mandy. And I am looking forward to this episode we're speaking about this week. This is a really interesting story and one we haven't heard of. And I just can't believe there's not more out there on this story.
Yeah, so we are really just going to get right into the story this week, and we'll kind of tell you a little bit more about how we found out about the story as we get into it. But as Melissa was saying, this is a story that really deserves to be shared and has not really received as much attention as some other stories have. On January 6th, 1981, 30-year-old Lonene Ray Rogers turned to her dad for help in leaving her husband Clinton, who went by Bud. Although Raymond Raffle had really little to spare in the way of finances, he gave his daughter $60 in the form of 3 $20 bills. And this was so that Lonnie and her kids could have a little bit of money to make a break from Bud and put some distance between them. It was no secret that Lonnie intended to tell her husband about her decision to leave him later that very night. When Lonnie and Bud first met in 1970, their relation started off very loving and fun. They met at the Erie Silence Club in Pennsylvania, which was a social club for the deaf community. Lonnie, who was born without hearing, and Bud, who lost his hearing in early childhood, hit it off right away after Lonnie started attending this club. They married in October of 1972 when Lonnie was 21, and they went on to have a son and a daughter together. But what started with Lonnie being swept off her feet by this charming, handsome, and kind man soon turned into a tumultuous marriage full of instability and chaos as Bud became controlling, possessive, and abusive. This week, we're delving into the story of Lonene Ray Rogers, or Lonnie, as she was known to her loved ones. We had the pleasure of working with Lonnie's daughter, Alison, to tell her mom's story, and we're so thankful that we were able to connect with Alison, and that really wouldn't have even been possible without the help of our wonderful Haley, who we always talk about so much on the show. She works for us doing research, and she just has her hand in so many different amazing things. She does volunteer work with Light the Way. We've mentioned them before. They work to reunite missing persons with their loved ones. And so when Haley heard about Lonnie's story, she shared it with us, and we were eager to learn more and share the story on the podcast. This episode was also put together with the help of Charlie from Crimelines. Thank you so much, Charlie. She generously shared her own research with us, and we appreciate that so much, especially in telling stories like this where it hasn't really had a lot of coverage and the family is really looking
Yeah.
to get an accurate story out there. It's really helpful when, the podcasts, especially who have covered it, can kind of come together and make sure we all have a nice cohesive story together. So thank you so much for that, Charlie.
So before we get into the details of what happened to Lonnie, let's go back to the beginning when Lonnie, the first child born to Maxine and Raymond Raffle, came into the world. It became obvious right away that there was something special about their new little bundle of joy. But having nothing to compare their parenting experience to, they weren't quite sure what was causing their baby to be unusually quiet. Unlike other babies, Lonnie rarely cried. She was never startled by loud noises or voices, but her parents weren't overly concerned and thought she was just developing at her own pace. It wasn't until Lonnie was 18 months old that Maxine and Raymond would receive a diagnosis that would shape their future and Lonnie's future. She was profoundly deaf. She could hear extremely loud noises, but she could not determine what that noise was. No one else in Lonnie's family was deaf, so despite the initial shock of learning that their daughter couldn't hear, Lonnie's parents and family quickly embraced her condition and refused to let her deafness stop her from living a full life. Lonnie became fluent in American Sign Language and mastered the skills of lip reading, which allowed her to navigate the world and have nothing denied to her because of her hearing impairment. Lonnie did the same things any kid would do growing up. She loved playing outside, and she had a close bond with her two younger sisters who were 5 and 13 years younger than her. So as we said before, Lonnie's childhood was pretty typical, but their home life was far from perfect. Maxine and Raymond had struggles of their own and often fought and drank a lot, and Raymond didn't have a stable job. The girls were left to fend for themselves and take care of each other a lot, which is how Lonnie ended up becoming such a nurturing figure for her sisters.
Lonnie was a truly vibrant soul who was full of energy. Music and dancing were things that brought her joy, even though she couldn't hear the music the same way that we could. Lonnie's parents were both dance instructors, so she was always tagging along to the dance studio and participating in classes there. Her daughter Alison told us that people at the dance studio may not have even known that she was deaf because she never let it stop her from participating. Lonnie went to a public high school with a special classroom for students who are hard of hearing or deaf. Her parents chose this route because they preferred to keep her close rather than sending her to a boarding school for the deaf, which was very common. But the deaf classroom at the high school did teach Lonnie how to read lips and speech, and the students from the hearing impaired classroom were able to join the other hearing students for some of the more general classes. When Lonnie was a senior, her parents wanted to move to Pennsylvania, so Lonnie stayed with relatives in the area and she was able to finish her senior year at the same high school. Alison told us a story about something that happened during Lonnie's senior year of school where they had this senior trip planned for the students to go to a concert, but the students in the deaf classroom weren't included in this because it was wrongly assumed that they wouldn't be able to hear or wouldn't be able to enjoy the music. But that's not the case at all. Many people who have hearing impairments actually love attending live music events because they can either hear parts of the music or they can feel the vibrations from the sound system. So Lonnie actually appealed to the school to allow her deaf classmates to attend, but their request was denied, which is so sad. So she and her classmates decided that they would just hold a car wash to raise the money and buy their own tickets to attend the concert. And that ended up being successful. And so the students from the deaf classroom were able to all go to the concert together.
I love that story so much. That just shows what a fighter. And she was like, no, we're going to do it. It's not going to stop us. And I love that.
Me too. In high school, Lonnie had her first serious relationship, but that unfortunately ended in heartbreak around the time she graduated, and she really struggled to move on from this breakup for many years. After she graduated, Lonnie moved to Pennsylvania, where her family lived, and her mom, Maxine, helped her get a job as an assembly worker in a factory. Maxine also worked in the factory, but Lonnie ended up surpassing her mom in speed and accuracy at work before too long. Lonnie was constantly getting praised at work and was even considered for advancement. And of course, her mom who got her this job, was very proud of her daughter for doing so well, but of course was like a little bit playfully just like, how are you doing better at this job than I am? She would joke to her, superiors and the people they worked with that Lonnie could only stay as long as Maxine could stay. So I thought that was it's just very adorable and funny.
Super cute. So things took a new turn in Lonnie's life when she met Bud, whose legal name is Clinton Rogers. Unlike Lonnie, Bud wasn't born without hearing, but when he was 3 years old, a severe car accident left him with a head injury that resulted in hearing loss, and he also had a metal plate placed in his skull. Bud was not totally deaf in the same way that Lonnie was. He was hard of hearing. Alison explained in our conversation that people who are hard of hearing may experience something like being underwater. Bud was able to hear sounds, but they were muffled and he couldn't understand them. Bud had a sister that he grew up with and was very close with. Their relationship was cute and endearing at first, but as they got older, it became more of an enabling relationship. As a teen, Bud struggled with attention-seeking behavior that often led him down a dark path. So, for example, he once lost a friendship after he killed some kittens and threw them down a drain, which is a pretty big deal and a red flag for what's to come. Bud attended the Western Pennsylvania School for the Deaf, which is considered to be one of the best schools for the deaf in the country. But the school was 2 hours away from Bud's family home, and so he didn't see him much other than during the holidays. Most of Bud's family didn't even know American Sign Language, or ASL as it's also called. After high school, Bud found work at a foundry where he manufactured machinery parts, but his life was really plagued with serious criminal activity. In 1970, he was sentenced to 23 months for aggravated assault and battery. Alison later clarified that this was actually for rape. He served 6 months before being released on good behavior. Shortly after this stint in jail, Bud met Lonnie and their relationship escalated quickly. After only about a year of dating, they were getting married. Alison told us that she believes the relationship moved too quickly for Lonnie to really see Bud's true colors before committing to marriage. Lonnie didn't even know about the crimes that Bud had committed before they got together, including this rape that he just spent time in jail for. And according to Alison, there were countless other stories involving Bud being violent against women, many times choking them. Even though Bud was handsome and very charming, something about his demeanor always felt off, according to Lonnie's parents. Lonnie's mom was actually so against the relationship that she cried when the couple announced they would be getting married. And this isn't like, I'm so excited for you. This is like devastating tears.
Right. Like scared, devastated. Right.
Yeah. She even cried in this heartbroken way at Lonnie and Bud's wedding and actually tried to bribe Lonnie with a new car if she would call the wedding off. But Lonnie married Bud anyway.
After the wedding, Lonnie and Bud moved into a small duplex that was owned by Lonnie's grandparents in Crawford County, Pennsylvania, and this was very close to Lonnie's own family. Things seemed to be off to an okay start at first, but it wasn't long before Bud's charming exterior started to crack and his darker side began to show through. Lonnie started confiding in her sister and complaining about the marriage pretty early on, and one of her main concerns was financial issues and Bud's irresponsible spending habits. They really had enough money to pay their bills, but Bud was just constantly using their money to buy whatever he wanted for himself, and he was doing this as a priority instead of taking care of household responsibilities. So he just had this impulsive attitude and kind of took like an Ariana Grande approach to it. This whole like, I see it, I like it, I want it, I got it. He just bought whatever he wanted.
I do love that line, Mandy. Thank you for including it. It was great.
You're welcome. But much of what Bud was spending the family's money on were expensive toys, like technology things. As someone who grew up with a dad who loved to buy things like that, like for himself, like I totally get the frustration. I know my mom growing up, was always just like, we don't need a 72-inch television. We need like school supplies for the kids, like just things like that. That can be the source of like a lot of arguments in a house. Yes. Mm-hmm. So aside from his poor money management, Bud had a short temper and he was constantly on edge. He would snap at Lonnie all the time, and at first she would be able to find little ways to calm him down and de-escalate their disagreements, but over time, that started becoming harder and harder to do. Bud just became more and more controlling. He was showing jealousy and possessiveness, and eventually he started becoming physically abusive. Alison believes that Bud would choke her mom, but she doesn't have any proof of that. She does have proof that at one point, Bud put his hands around her aunt's throat and started choking her until Lonnie was able to step in and make him stop. As we mentioned before, the couple got married in October of 1972. And before that year was even over, Bud broke into a woman's car and was ordered to pay restitution. And he tried to blame this incident, this crime, on his childhood car accident, the one that left him without hearing. In 1975, Lonnie gave birth to Alison and left her job to be home with her new baby, which was something that Bud actually fully supported. This was in the 1970s, and he kind of subscribed to the very 1970s belief that women belonged at home raising the kids. So he was fine with that. He ended up getting a second job to make up for the loss of income when Lonnie stopped working. But this arrangement certainly did not change Bud into a responsible and loving family man. And we're going to get into all of that and more after a quick break to hear a word from this week's sponsors.
So before the break, Bud and Lonnie have just had their new baby, Alison. Bud is going to work a second job. Lonnie is staying home with Alison. And there's definitely trouble in the marriage, but no one really knows to what extent at this point. So Bud's criminal activity and his short fuse continued to get worse over the years. Charges for breaking and entering, burglary, and providing false reports to the police started to stack up. In 1977, Bud actually staged a robbery at the bar he worked at. He had already been suspected of stealing small amounts of cash from the register, but this time he decided to steal the hefty sum of $700, which today would be around $3,800. He tried to cover his tracks by shattering a glass door and making up a story about being held up by masked intruders with guns. He claimed that he was shot at, but the bullet went through his baseball hat and miraculously didn't hit him. But the police saw right through his story and he was arrested. If I remember correctly, wasn't the glass on the wrong side of the door?
I believe so.
When we talked to Alison? Yeah,
Yes.
it was so obvious that it wasn't actually what he was saying went
Right.
on. So from this robbery, he was sentenced to pay restitution and serve 6 to 12 months behind bars. Meanwhile, Lonnie was actually pregnant with the couple's second child, a son named Aaron. Since Bud was the sole provider for the family, he was able to work something out where he could leave jail to work. I've known people who have had this kind of situation, and it actually is a pretty great program that people don't lose their job. That's going to cause such a bigger problem with some of these crimes.
And that's more of a punishment for the family that he
Absolutely.
has at home that has been relying on him to take care of them. A woman and a pregnant woman and a child who need their bills paid and need to put food on the table. So I'm all for things like that where they can leave and go to work and then be where they need to be.
Come back in
overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So Alison also said that Bud always knew how to use his disability to his advantage, and he really played up his role as a husband in order to get out of trouble. After he was released, he went to live with his parents for a while before ultimately moving back in with Lonnie. But by this time, which was towards the end of the 1970s, Lonnie knew things weren't going to work out long-term with Bud. The relationship was really close to coming to an end. Lonnie got herself a part-time job as a housekeeper at a hotel so she could start establishing herself to becoming a single mom. In November of 1980, Lonnie was closer than ever to finally making a move to get out of the marriage. She took her kids to her family's house in Toledo, Ohio for Thanksgiving that year, but Bud wasn't along with them. During this visit, Lonnie told her sister about her plans to leave Bud, but she said that she intended to let him spend Christmas with the kids. It was planned that Bud was supposed to stay at the house for Christmas and then leave, but after Christmas was over, Bud refused to leave. From that point on, things were more hostile than ever. Bud started demanding to know where Lonnie was at all times, who she was with, and who she had talked to on any given day. He frequently expressed paranoia that she was having an affair with a man named Arthur who worked with Lonnie at the hotel. Lonnie and Arthur were friends, and he was really always there to lend an ear, but their relationship was purely platonic and nothing more.
On January 6, 1981, Lonnie was ready to make a bold move, and she was finally going to escape from her abusive and controlling husband. Lonnie reached out to her dad, who gave her $60 to help in her plan. Later that evening, Lonnie left work and picked her kids up from the babysitter and went home where she planned to confront Bud and tell him she was leaving for good. But Lonnie was never seen or heard from again after that night. Bud would later claim that on the night of January 6th, he and Lonnie started arguing and their fight continued into the early hours of the next day, but he said he did eventually go to bed. Bud claims he woke up at around 2 a.m. and realized that Lonnie wasn't in bed with him, but he didn't think much of it, he didn't think it was alarming, and he assumed that she was just sleeping on the couch. But neighbors told police they heard loud banging noises coming from the Rogers home that night, which was unfortunately something they were used to hearing because Bud and Lonnie fought pretty often. Bud claimed that he last saw his wife around 12:45 a.m. on January 7th. Something important to note about that night was that there happened to be a raging blizzard going on outside, so it's unlikely that Lonnie would have left home in the middle of the night on her own accord. But what Bud told the police was that by 3 a.m., he had just randomly woken up, realized Lonnie was gone, woke up their children and got them dressed, did the dishes, and then drove the kids to their babysitter Sandy's house at 3-something in the morning. So what on earth? Imagine Sandy's surprise when she is woken up in the middle of the night, someone's knocking on her door, and here's Bud and the 2 kids that she babysits standing there like 5 hours before
5
they're
hours
normally
early?
dropped off. Yeah, he normally would
Wow.
drop them off at 8 or 8:30. So instantly, Sandy knows there's something really off. This is a very unusual situation. Doesn't know what's going on, but takes the kids inside. Bud explains to Sandy that Lonnie was gone and he had to go out and look for her. Sandy later said that Bud seemed very nervous and he asked if he could borrow a blanket. So she did give him one and he never returned that blanket to her. So Bud leaves the kids with Sandy. He goes and is searching for his wife, allegedly. He then comes back and tells Sandy he never did find Lonnie, but at this point it's time for him to head into work. So he does leave the kids there for the whole day and he heads into work where he clocks in on time at 6 a.m. and never mentions to anyone at his job that his wife is missing and he's been up all night in a blizzard, out in his car, searching for his wife, doesn't know where she is. He's just there like it's a routine day on the job.
Wow. So meanwhile, Sandy was at home with Lonnie's kids, wondering what was going on. Bud's story, of course, was not adding up, and it made no sense. If Lonnie wanted to leave in the middle of a blizzard, she literally could have gone 100 yards away to her grandparents' house. But Sandy had doubts that Lonnie would have left her children with Bud and ventured out on her own while there's this dangerous snowstorm going on. Sandy knew that Lonnie was trying to end her troubled marriage, and the situation was even more concerning because of the blizzard and the plummeting temperatures. She also thought it was strange that when Bud arrived, he was anxious and sweating. Bud allegedly went to search for Lonnie, but then showed up to work 3 hours later as if nothing was wrong. Sandy decided to get in touch with Lonnie's parents to let them know what was happening and to see if they could help. Lonnie's dad and grandfather quickly went over to Lonnie and Bud's house, but nobody was there. So they kicked down the door to get inside. They noticed that the house itself was in immaculate condition, which was strange considering the circumstances. Lonnie's dad knew that she was planning on leaving Bud that night, but they also knew this wasn't how she was going to do it and that something was wrong. So then they reported her missing to the police. At first, they were told to wait 24 hours before filing a missing persons report, but Lonnie's dad threatened to take matters into his own hands, and the police relented and agreed to start looking into Lonnie's whereabouts right away. Good for him.
Yeah, go dad.
Officers arrived at the Rogers home and waited for Bud to return from work. The police searched the house while they were there waiting and noticed that Lonnie's wallet, car keys, glasses, and hearing aids were left behind. Her boots, jeans, and coat were all missing, as well as a king-sized pink blanket. And this was very obvious to her father, who knew that this pink blanket was usually draped on top of the couch, so immediately he knew that this was missing. So now that means there are 2 blankets missing, the one from the couch and the one Bud borrowed from the babysitter, Sandy.
When Bud's shift ended at work that day, he picked the kids up from Sandy and went home where Lonnie's father and grandfather were already waiting and very eager to confront him. Lonnie's daughter Alison said she remembers that Bud was surprised to see them there and he got angry that they entered the house without his permission. So they started having this all-out screaming match. Bud told the police that Lonnie had just simply left and suggested it was probably with another man, even though there is no evidence to suggest that whatsoever. Interestingly, when they looked into Bud's wallet, they found 3 $20 bills, which as we mentioned in the beginning of the episode, was the exact amount and type of money that Lonnie's dad gave her that night when she was asking for funds to help get out of this whole situation. Bud alleged that Lonnie actually gave him this money so that he could pay bills, but we know this isn't the truth. Lonnie was planning on using that money to leave, and it really looked more like Bud had stolen the money from Lonnie. There was no evidence collected from Lonnie and Bud's home at this time. The area around the house was searched as much as they could, but since there was this blizzard going on outside, it was really hard for them to do a thorough job. Bud didn't help with any of this. Instead, he was actually seen by Lonnie's family members and volunteer searchers as he sat in the upstairs apartment window just watching everybody else wade through the snow and just searching for his wife in these frigid temperatures, looking for any sign of her. And he never came down and offered to help, not even one time.
Wow.
In our conversation with Alison, she told us that there's a common misconception about her mom's case, that there just wasn't any attempts to interview Bud, but that really isn't entirely true. There were interviews that took place, but apparently they were unable to get an interpreter for him, so the investigators couldn't conduct what they were calling a formal interview. Alison said, she would actually say that what they weren't able to do was an effective interview because they weren't able to get somebody who could translate and, who could speak American Sign Language and was able to interpret for him.
That was up to what the police department would. They could have gotten somebody like Sandy or, Sandy's daughter who can translate, but they needed a specific person and apparently just did not search enough to find one.
Right. So there were newspapers that reported that Bud was just being very cooperative and he was working with the police, but he really wasn't. They only wrote that because he told the police that he was deaf and couldn't communicate with them. So then these interviews stopped, but somehow this was viewed as his cooperation. And Alison, says that really just gives a false impression of his willingness to help. He wasn't really that willing to help in the first place. And Bud never really had to go on the defensive with the police because right from the start, they weren't on the offensive with him. So he was able to kind of sit back and play it cool right from the beginning.
Alison shared her recollection of the night her mom went missing in her Facebook group. Alison was just 5 years old and her brother Aaron was 3. She said that in the early morning hours of January 7th, she was suddenly woken up by her father, who was hurrying them to get dressed. It was the middle of the night and it was snowing hard, so the kids were confused, but Bud told them their mom had left them for another man. Alison said there was no emotion in his voice as he said this, and that's when they went to their babysitter's house. Alison shared that the babysitter, Sandy, was a friend of Lonnie's who was also in the deaf community. Sandy actually woke up her own daughter who was not deaf so she could help contact Lonnie's family. Alison remembers that their house was very clean with nothing out of place and that all of the beds were made and there were no dishes in the sink, which is super unusual if you find out your wife is missing in the middle of the night and the first thing you think is, I should be cleaning up in here. That makes absolutely no sense. So when Bud came back to pick Alison and Aaron up from the sitter later that evening, it was as if it was just a typical day, up until the point that he realized that Lonnie's dad and grandfather had kicked in the door and the police were already involved. He probably didn't think Sandy was going to call, communicate with these other people. He thought he still had time. Alison said she remembers feeling terrified as all the chaos and yelling broke out, but she knew she just had to keep her 3-year-old brother distracted and happy. So she started playing with her new Bee Gees record player that she just got for Christmas to entertain him. So she said her attention was 25% on her brother and 75% on trying to figure out what's going on with her dad and grandpa in her kitchen and, of course, where her mom was. She said she remembers her grandpa's reaction to finding out that Bud had the $60 in his wallet. He yelled, quote, "I gave Lonnie $60 yesterday. Where did you get that money?" End quote. And the police stood idly by while all this went on and eventually ordered Lonnie's dad and grandfather to leave.
After Lonnie disappeared, Alison and her brother were bounced around. They lived with Bud, other family members, friends, and even the foster care system. Bud was never the attentive, doting type of dad, and his erratic and neglectful behavior led to numerous visits from Child Protective Services. The kids lived with Lonnie's sister in Toledo for a while, and that did seem like a promising new start, but after just 1 week of this new arrangement, Bud showed up in a rage and got the kids back. Their aunt tried calling police, but since Bud was their biological father, there was nothing that could be done to stop him from taking Alison and her little brother. Instead of taking them back home, though, Bud took them straight over to his own sister, Laura's house, and dropped them off there. This is the sister that he was very close with growing up, and their relationship kind of turned a little bit into an enabling relationship. She told Bud that he should get an attorney so he could prevent Lonnie's family from having any access to the kids. And that's really exactly what happened. Alison and Aaron were intentionally kept as far away from Lonnie's family as possible. Alison told us that she was able to reconnect with her family, but not until after she became an adult. And that's when she learned that they had always wanted to stay in touch with Alison and Aaron. They had been sending cards and gifts their whole life, but these things were never given to them. The kids stayed with Laura for a while, with Bud showing up about once a month, and he would just come visit and do the fun dad thing. He would take them and do something cool, and then he would always drop them back off with his sister and disappear again. At this time, Laura and her husband had 4 kids of their own, so things were a little bit cramped, and Alison always got the sense that Laura's kids weren't really that thrilled to have her and her brother staying there with them. After 2 years of this, Bud took the kids back, and at that point, all they really knew and had a memory of was this fun dad who showed up once a month, and they didn't have any idea what actually living with Bud was going to be like. And it was anything but fun.
Alison recalled that when she was about 8, Bud was dating someone. His girlfriend would actually complain to Alison, who was a literal child, about Bud's abusive behavior, and she also told Alison that her dad was responsible for Lonnie's disappearance. The two of them would argue in front of the kids regularly, and in one argument, Bud even kicked the woman out of the house. At this point, Alison was pretty much in charge of her little brother. She took care of him on her own when Bud would leave them by themselves for hours, and she had to learn at a very young age how to look after Aaron and how to feed them both. And where was Bud, you might ask? Mostly, he was sleeping over at another girlfriend's house. This girlfriend had kids of her own, but didn't seem bothered that Bud was leaving his young kids at home to fend for themselves. Another woman that Bud started dating and is actually still with to this day is a registered sex offender herself. So after Lonnie's disappearance, Bud continued to have a hard time managing his finances and paying bills, so there were plenty of struggles as a result of money, and they moved from place to place constantly. When Alison started 5th grade, it was the first time she and her brother were separated and had to go to different schools. Since Bud was never around, Aaron, who was in 3rd grade at this point, had to get himself ready for school and had to figure out how to get to school on his own because Alison had to go to her own school and she couldn't help him anymore. So this meant that Aaron was often late to school at really no fault of his own. No young kid should ever be responsible for getting themselves ready and out the door, which is wild he even went to school because who's there to stop you? Who's there to say you can't stay home today?
3rd grade is so little.
Breaks
Just even
my heart.
thinking of that breaks my heart, of a little boy waking up and not having a parent to help him get ready for school and to make sure they get there. Like, that is truly just sad.
I agree. Eventually, though, Aaron's school was concerned enough about the neglect that they alerted CPS, and a social worker went over to the house to look into things. Alison had to interpret for Bud, who was told not to leave the kids alone ever again, but of course, he disregarded this advice. A social worker later visited the school on one occasion and learned that the kids hadn't been picked up yet, so they were taken into foster care on the spot. They ended up going back to live with Laura, where they stayed for about a year before moving back in with Bud yet again.
This time, Bud seemed to be doing a little bit better at the whole parenting thing. And by a little bit, I really just mean a teeny tiny little bit. He was still leaving the kids at home on their own for days at a time. And even though there was a social worker involved, they didn't really seem to realize everything that was going on in the house. As Alison got older, Bud started becoming more and more hostile and violent towards her, which she thinks is because she started to remind him of her mom, Lonnie. She said there was really no point in ever trying to figure out Bud's moods because he was so unpredictable, and he would just hit Alison anytime he felt like it, and he would often threaten to send her away. But he didn't treat his son Aaron the same way. At one point, the social worker for the family confronted Bud about leaving Allison and Aaron alone and questioned him about an incident when he had slapped Allison so hard that she fell down. Bud later went into a rage because Allison told the social worker about these things, and Allison at that point said she had enough and she ran away to a friend's house. But when the social worker, who was kind of keeping up with the family, realized that Allison had left the house, they went and got her and made her go back to Laura's house again, and that's Bud's sister. At this point, Bud had decided to keep Aaron at home with him, but didn't care if Allison lived elsewhere. Bud did manage to get custody of Allison back, though, less than 2 years later. Allison said her dad never told her he wasn't involved in her mother's disappearance, and the topic was rarely brought up. Allison and Aaron weren't allowed to talk about Lonnie, and it was like her name was a swear word. Bud would occasionally mention Lonnie, but only to slander her and say things like, she ran away with a man, or she didn't love you, and she left me with you.
Man.
Just these horribly abusive things to say to your children.
Yeah.
Bud had this arrogance about him when it came to Lonnie's disappearance, and instead of ever denying his involvement, he would say things along the lines of, hard to find, can't prove it. So basically just, saying like, good luck to you if you ever want to try and pin this on me. He would always claim that Lonnie was with someone else or that she was in some other specific place. One time he even said that she went down to Florida, but he never outright denied that he had anything to do with her disappearance. Allison never even let herself think about the possibility that her dad was actually responsible for this until she was around 12 years old. And that was the age when she started to kind of mature and she became old enough to realize that Bud was lying to her.
This is one of the saddest parts of the story to me, but when Allison was just 14 years old, Bud drove her down to the local police station and had her interpret for him. He actually told an officer, and she's having to tell the officer.
Right. He's telling her, and she's having to repeat this out loud to the officer standing there.
And so she had to say, bad girl, I'm finished with her. About his own daughter, telling the police, I don't even want this.
So sad. So heartbreaking.
I can't wrap my brain around that. So what came before this is they were driving to a restaurant to celebrate Aaron's birthday, and Bud was forcing Allison to ride in the bed of his truck. It's 40 degrees, and obviously Allison feels unsafe and uncomfortable, so she gets Bud's attention, but he ignores her and pulls into the police station. Bud told Allison to tell the officer that she was bad and that Bud wasn't taking her home. The officer tells Bud he can't just leave Allison there, but Bud was insistent that he wasn't taking her with him. Since Allison had stayed with her aunt in the past, she called to see if she would come get her, but the aunt refused. And so she said she didn't even think of contacting anyone in Lonnie's family because they hadn't been in her life the whole time and were essentially strangers. This gives me chills, but the officer asked Allison if there was anyone else she could call, and she was trying to think of someone, and then she puts her hand in her pocket and feels a piece of paper she had forgotten about. Her school guidance counselor had previously written her number down on this piece of paper and gave it to Allison and told her to call if she ever needed anything. I'm trying not to cry.
I know. I actually have goosebumps too because this is this is the most amazing part of the story to me. Like, this definitely is truly amazing. This guidance counselor is literally an angel on earth.
Absolutely. So Allison gives this piece of paper to the officer, and they called the counselor, Judy Dinsmore. When Judy heard that Allison needed help, she rushed to the police station to pick her up. So the Dinsmores eventually filed for custody of Allison, which they were granted for 6 months as a temporary solution while they figured out a final custody arrangement. Bud showed up to the first custody hearing, but he didn't show up to the hearing 6 months later, and the Dinsmores were granted sole legal and physical custody of Allison. Aaron ended up staying with Bud and unfortunately continued getting kicked out and bounced around to different friends and family members' homes. At some point, he left Bud's house and he never went back. Allison's new adoptive mom, Judy, helped her honor and remember her mom and helped them get Lonnie declared legally dead so she could get her Social Security benefits to use towards the kids' college tuition. And Allison said she agreed to this because to her, it was like her mom was helping send her to college. But almost immediately after Lonnie is declared dead, Bud cashes in on a life insurance policy in her name. When Alison was 18 years old, Judy helped her get in touch with authorities about looking into her mother's case. She was told that without a body, the case against Bud was too circumstantial to bring to trial, but otherwise they had everything they needed to convict Bud of murder. Alison has pleaded with the DA's office over the years to prosecute her father, but they have refused to do so until they know they can win the case. But with Bud now in his 70s, Alison is losing hope that the case will move forward. And we still have more to get into after one last break to hear a word from this week's sponsors.
Before the break, we have been talking about the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Lonene or Lonnie Ray Rogers, and just kind of the things that her kids, Alison and Aaron, have had to go through in the wake of their mother's disappearance. And at this point in the story, the police still are not ready to prosecute the case against her father. Sometime around 2009, an ex-girlfriend of Bud's who dated him during Alison's childhood reached out to her and wanted to meet up and share information about Lonnie's disappearance. This meeting wasn't really particularly helpful, though, because the only thing the woman told Alison was that Bud was responsible for Lonnie's disappearance, which is something that Alison already has known pretty much her whole life. And this woman had no concrete evidence or proof to back up the claims, which is what they are so desperate to have at all, so that they are able to even make a case against Bud. In 2021, Alison went to Erie, Pennsylvania to speak with the police there about the case. And this is when she found out that there was never a formal interview done with her father due to the lack of a sign language interpreter. They told her that interpreters for police interviews have to be certified by the court, and there's all this red tape to go through before they can actually be used. And evidently, it's harder to come by interpreters who actually meet this level of certification, which, like you were saying before, is extremely frustrating in a case like this when this is the difference between being able to speak to a suspect in the case. I think it's worth trying to find the person that can get that done for you.
You've had decades at this point.
Exactly, right. But Alison's being told that the only reason they haven't been able to really get an interview in is because they haven't made the effort to find the correctly certified interpreter for him, which is just really frustrating because that definitely seems like a non-issue issue that they should be able to resolve very quickly.
Right.
So around this time, Alison also created a Facebook group called Justice for Lonene. Before she made the group private, Bud actually joined and I guess was just lurking around in there. Yeah. So Alison actually called him out and said something, along the lines of, hey, welcome, Bud. Can see you're part of the group. Surprised you're here, but hopefully you can see that we are actually getting closer to, arresting you.
So great.
Yeah, me too. I would do the same thing. Like, why are you in my group? Like, clearly you're just here trying to be nosy and get information and see what, we have against you. And yeah.
And now everyone knows you're here, so.
Right, correct. So now, but apparently he didn't leave the group. Alison said that he either silenced the group or deactivated his Facebook, maybe something along those lines, but he did not actually leave the group. So the Facebook group has actually been really helpful, and Alison has learned a lot more information about her mom's case through the group. She learned that after her mom disappeared, a friend of Lonnie's took a restraining order out against Bud because he choked her, the friend of Lonnie, because the friend was asking about Lonnie and what happened to her. So Bud choked this woman, and she then filed a restraining order. Very, very scary. Bud actually got banned from the social club, the deaf social club that they were part of because of this incident. In another instance, a man named Richard, who was one of Bud's old friends, sent Alison a message and recounted a story that he was told by Bud's ex-girlfriend, Marie. So this woman, Marie, told Richard she once rode in the car with Bud and he stopped near a secluded wooded area on Church Street. And he got out of the car and briefly went into the woods while Marie stayed in the car and waited. When Bud got back to the car, Marie nervously asked Bud if Lonnie was out there in the woods. And Bud became immediately angry and told Marie if she ever mentioned that again, she would be joining Lonnie out there. Marie was terrified and told Richard that if anything ever happened to her, to tell the police to look out there on Church Street. Richard actually took this information to the police, but he was dismissed and they told him it was just hearsay. It's not credible. There's nothing they can really do. They're not going out there to look into this. So now that Allison's got this Facebook group, Richard is again reaching out to her to mention this and to find out if the police even knew about this. And Allison was able to talk to the investigator and find out they did make a note of this, of Marie's story, but it was never looked into any further, as we said, due to lack of sufficient evidence. Allison was determined to get the police to investigate this lead, and she recorded a conversation with Richard where she was able to translate their sign language conversation out loud for the police.
Alison requested that police bring in cadaver dogs to search the area, but the police again refused. A woman from the Facebook group who worked with cadaver dogs independently ended up hearing about all of this and offered to bring her dogs to search the woods on Church Street. Both of the dogs actually did indicate interest in the same tree multiple times and in different seasons. Eventually, Alison was able to convince the police to do their own search, but they didn't find anything. So, determined to prove that there was something to this theory, Alison rallied volunteers and got permission from the landowner to cut down the tree that the independent cadaver dogs had alerted on. They actually documented this whole thing on Facebook Live as they pulled up the tree and had the cadaver dogs come back again to check things out. The dog once again indicated interest at the tree's roots and then looked upward towards the top of the tree. A tree expert actually told Alison that if Lonnie's body had been buried under this tree for 40 years, it's possible that her remains had become a part of the tree itself, with the roots absorbing her DNA as her body decomposed. Alison wanted to find a way to test the tree for DNA, but she wasn't able to get anywhere with that. In 2021, Lonnie's story was televised, and it was announced that Bud was a person of interest in what was considered an active criminal investigation. Alison had actually never been told that her mom's case was active or that Bud was a person of interest. She had always been told that Lonnie's case was a civil missing persons case, and Bud was not a suspect or a person of interest. She actually had no idea until this interview that she participated in. She's told this information. I can't imagine hearing that for the first time during this story. I just can't imagine.
Right. And you would almost be like confused, like you'd be happy to hear that this was an active investigation,
Absolutely.
but then you would also be like, okay, but then why have I not been included this whole time in this active investigation? Like, what's been going on here?
In July of 2021, Alison told Erie News Now that she believes her father is responsible and that people out there know information that could help convict him. Alison thinks that Bud lost his temper and possibly choked her mom to death when she told him that she was taking the kids and leaving. She doesn't necessarily think murder was the end goal, but that his violence went too far on this occasion. And this theory is credible considering Bud had a history of choking women, and also there was no blood found in the house to suggest a more gruesome murder. Alison thinks that Bud hit her mom after he killed her, and that when he dropped her and Aaron off at the babysitter's house, it was so he could go off and find somewhere else to hide Lonnie's body. Alison does not believe her mom left willingly or that she would have ever left her kids with their abusive father, much less in the middle of the night in a blizzard.
Over the years, Alison has been told to check the foundry where Bud worked for over 30 years due to rumors that he may have used the foundry to dispose of Lonnie's body. There's this theory that he used the tools at the foundry to melt Lonnie's body, but Alison says this isn't possible because the water concentration of the human body would have caused the machine to actually explode, so it really is not.
They would have known right away.
Right. The police have also said the foundry was investigated thoroughly, and they do not believe Lonnie was ever taken there. In August of 2021, Alison told WKYC that the answers to her mom's case may lie within the deaf community, and that is an extremely tight-knit community. The people who do know Bud are scared of him, so it's very possible that they won't come forward with information until after he's dead. Alison understands their apprehension, but at the same time, she points out that Bud's just an old man now, and he's got a lot of eyes on him, so he can't really hurt anyone. Alison has also published a book about Lonnie's disappearance titled A Daughter's Journey and Story of Resilience, which you can find on Amazon, and we will, of course, link in the show notes. She also helped her son write a children's book called Rudy the Resilient Rhinoceros, which was inspired by her son's desire to help in the investigation for Lonnie. This children's book is about a rhinoceros whose father is taken by zoologists, not to hurt him, but to study and protect him. But either way, he's being taken away from Rudy and his mom. So they have to go through the grieving process. Rudy decides to be resilient and make his dad proud. And then when his dad is returned by the zoologist, the dad, is very happy to be reunited and tells his son he knew he didn't have to worry because Rudy would take care of himself and his mom. Sounds like a really cute book. I want to get a copy of that. So as of today, though, Lonnie's case is frozen. Alison is being told that the police are just really busy and they don't have the time or the manpower to investigate further. Alison is working towards getting billboards put up in Erie and in the town where Bud's currently living, and she wants to distribute advocacy cards that she has made to all the local businesses in Bud's town. Again, love Alison and everything that she's doing. I just think that's so great. I love that. Make him uncomfortable. Put this information everywhere. So even everywhere he goes, he's like, oh, there's that card again with all this information about me. Alison is also fighting for Lonnie's Law, which is a proposed piece of legislation that spawned from Lonnie's family being unable to access her case files. They believe if they had been able to access these files, they might have been able to add helpful information that the police could have overlooked or just not considered. But the police have said it's against Pennsylvania state policy to share case files outside of a law enforcement agency.
For years, Lonnie's family has been fighting to uncover the truth behind what happened to her. They've been in and out of court trying to get access to the case files through the PA Right to Know law and a FOIA request, but their attempts have been denied. The family argues that Lonnie's case is still a missing persons case, not a criminal case, so they believe they should have access to the files. The court, though, disagrees and says since the case could potentially evolve into a criminal investigation, the files should remain sealed. They contained sensitive information, including victim details and data about minors at the time of Lonnie's disappearance. Court documents show that files include police reports, witness statements, photos, and investigative notes, which are sensitive pieces of evidence in a criminal case. Alison, though, wants to pass Lonnie's Law, which would give families access to case files after 20 years of unsolved investigation. This makes so much sense to me. I just can't believe this hasn't been done everywhere, and I'm so glad she's spearheading this. So the argument here is that unsolved cases automatically lose their active investigative nature after 20 years, and families should be given the chance to understand what efforts have been made to solve their loved one's case. It could provide the opportunity for families to connect dots that may have been missed or offer a fresh perspective and a sense of closure to cold cases. To support Lonnie's Law, Alison is urging the public to learn more about Lonnie's story and sign the petition on change.org. Of course, we'll have that in our show notes and we'll have it on social media. Her immediate focus is passing this law in Pennsylvania, but of course, Alison would eventually like to see Lonnie's Law enacted nationwide. Even though Lonnie's story is a tragedy, Alison wants everyone to know that it's also a story of resilience and determination. Lonnie fought for a better life, and now Alison is fighting for justice and transparency on her behalf so that no other family has to go through what they have. And so we want to give you guys options on how you can help. And some of the things that Alison told us was to, of course, share our podcast about Lonnie's case. You can also buy Alison's book, A Daughter's Journey and Story of Resilience, or her son's new book, Rudy the Resilient Rhinoceros, again, in the show notes, and they're on social media. You can join the Facebook group, sign the petition. Mandy and I are going to sign it today, and share Lonnie's poster. So there's several ways you can help out. So just to recap, Lonene Ray Lonnie Rogers was last verifiably seen on the evening of January 6, 1981. According to her husband, Bud, he last saw her around 12:45 a.m. on January 7th at their home in Hayfield Township, Pennsylvania. He claims she left during the middle of a snowstorm after an argument, and she left behind all of her belongings, including her purse, hearing aids, medication, and car keys. Lonnie has long sandy brown hair, gray eyes, and freckles. Her ears are pierced. At the time of her disappearance, she may have been wearing a navy blue pea coat, blue jeans, and high brown boots. If you have information in Lonnie's case, please call the Pennsylvania State Police at 814-332-6911. Meeting Alison was incredible. This is somebody who is beyond resilient, who has really taken charge of her mom's case. This kid who, grew up knowing her mom loved her, but she can't even be around her mom's family. I don't know. There's just so much to this story. And then how frustrating it has to be like, you guys know he did it. I know he did it, but somehow we can't, get this together and charge him because they're afraid later they'll have more evidence. Well, it's been 40 years. You don't have the evidence. give them the files.
Right. And like she said, after 20 years, like how long are you going to keep not allowing us to have access to it forever? It's like people are getting older. People want answers before they're not here to find answers anymore. And yeah, I totally agree. It doesn't make any sense why. I do feel that it should have already been done. After a certain period of time, the family should have access to everything so that they can see what's been going on. Because that honestly, just being in the dark causes a lot of anxiety and a lot of just uncertainty on its own because you don't know what's going on.
The fact that she didn't know Bud was a person of interest until 2021?
Right.
That's wild. How does she not have that kind of information? It's not because she's ignoring it. She's doing the work. So
right.
how does she not know something that's that big of a piece of information? So definitely sign the change.org petition because they need as many signatures as possible on that to help change the law. So what an inspiration that Alison is. And I don't know. I really hope that she and her family get answers.
Okay, so normally when we have episodes like this where we've worked with the family, we will kind of take a break from Last Thing Before We Go. But this week, we actually have a little Last Thing Before We Go. We have some fun facts that we are going to go. Well, Melissa has fun facts. Melissa has all the fun facts.
I have all the facts.
You're full of fun facts.
I'm full of it, is what some people say. Well, I just thought this story was so interesting, and I've always been fascinated by American Sign Language. And
me too.
Obviously, right? And this was so heavily involved in this case. So I just looked up some ASL facts, to be quite honest. Mandy, did you know that sign language is the 4th most popular language in the world?
I did, actually.
Sense. You did?
Yeah. Well, I knew that. Yes, I did know that. And also, I actually learned how popular it was as a language in high school when that was an option to take for a foreign language class. Instead of taking Spanish or French or something, you could take sign language. And I kind of wish that I had done that instead of Spanish.
Yeah. I know. I think it's incredible. I learned some when I was little, but of course, if you don't use it, you're not.
I can do, I think, most of the alphabet now, but I can't do any like words. I don't know any words or like anything meaningful. I would be sitting there all day long spelling out word like letters on
finger spelling.
Exactly.
Yeah. But honestly, that's great. I remember when I worked for an orthopedic surgeon, we had a patient who was unable to hear. And so he and I would finger spell to each other. And he was always like so appreciative. He would write it down on papers or he would email me because like, even though it took me forever, like we could communicate and like, I don't know, I was always so happy that like I knew that much.
Yeah.
So yeah, if your kids can take it, I think it's a great thing to take. So a couple things I learned that I had no idea about that I thought were interesting was that there's a guy named William Dummy Hoy. His nickname was Dummy at the time, but he was the first deaf Major League Baseball player. He hit the first Grand Slam home run in the American League and created the hand signals that are still used in baseball today.
Wow.
Like you see them doing all the, like he's the one that did it. That's incredible.
Wow. I had no idea.
I'm about to blow your mind with this one because this one I was like, are you serious? So Paul Hubbard, he was at a college for deaf persons and he played quarterback on the football team back in the 1890s. So since the other players on his team were deaf, he devised the huddle system for calling plays so the players could keep their ASL signing hidden from the opposing team. So they would all huddle together, do the signing. Isn't that incredible?
That is so cool because like you said, these are things that we still see in sports, like that have still carried over. Mm-hmm. And I had no idea that people who were hard of hearing or deaf were responsible for these like
so
iconic
cool.
and like things that are just
part of our everyday life. And I just think that's incredible. So yeah, I don't know. This has me wanting to learn more sign language and, just watch some videos and see what you can do. You just never know when you could use it. So, wow, I really am so thankful we got to share this story and thankful for Alison and her family and just wish them nothing but the best.
Absolutely. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening this week. We will be back next week. Same time, same place, new story.
Have a great week.
Bye.